Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to unpack the completely fascinating mechanics behind how societies grow and how individuals actually adopt new ideas. Think about human society like it's this massive, incredibly complex operating system. To progress, it constantly needs software updates, right? So, we're going to focus on two foundational theories of development communication that try to explain exactly how this software update is successfully installed across an entire population. So that brings us to a huge foundational question. How does a whole society actually change? When a new, supposedly better way of doing things drops, how does that massive societal system upgrade its software? Is it something that is forced from the top down by governments and elites? Or is it something chosen individually, from the bottom up, one person at a time? To figure that out, we first need to define what we even mean when we talk about a society upgrading. In the academic world, we call this development. Development is a fundamental cultural process that marks the transition from an agrarian society to an industrial one. But honestly, it is so much more than just economics. It encompasses economic, social, and technological well-being. It's not just a straight line, it's a wildly complex system full of shifting variables, information interdependence, and constant feedback loops. And the stakes here are incredibly high, because understanding this process is literally the key to solving massive issues like the wealth gap, health crises, and technological access.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the macro-societal view by looking at the meaning of development and learners' modernization model. Then we'll check out the flaws in the blueprint. After that, we're going to zoom all the way into the micro-psychological view to explore the diffusion of innovation, why we adopt new ideas, and finally, the 5 stages of adoption.
Section 1. Meaning of development. A shift to modernization. Historically, it's really important to remember that development was viewed as this singular, linear push toward modernization. Basically, if a nation wanted to progress, it simply had to follow the exact path already carved out by the industrialized world. Section 2. Learner's model. The dominant paradigm. Okay, let's dive into this first massive blueprint from the 1950s and 60s. During this era, development was viewed purely through the lens of economic growth, urbanization, and industrialization. It was what we call the dominant paradigm of development. Daniel Lerner, who was a really major theorist back then, basically believed that if you wanted to transition a static, rigid agricultural society into a dynamic modern one, you essentially had to push 4 specific buttons. He called these the 4 indices of development: industrialization, literacy, media exposure, and political participation. Lerner and his contemporaries believed that if you just cranked up the mass media to expose people to new ideas, improved literacy, and drove industrialization, well, society would naturally mobilize and progress. Now, this whole approach relied heavily on what we call the trickle-down theory. It was strictly a top-down model. The thinking was that the benefits of all this industrialization and modernization would just magically flow from the affluent elites right down to the impoverished masses. Communication was entirely one way, from the authorities down to the people via mass media. And here's the wild part. If a nation remained underdeveloped, this model actually blamed the individuals. It assumed the underdevelopment was happening because the masses were just stubbornly resisting change and clinging to traditional values. They essentially blamed the user for refusing to install the software update.
Section 3. Flaws in the blueprint. The paradigm's failures. But, as we all know, every blueprint has its flaws. And this top-down push, it totally missed the mark in reality. When this model was actually put to the test, the results were definitely not the utopian modernization everyone expected.
The crucial takeaway here is that forcing the update just didn't work. The trickle-down effect, well, it didn't trickle down. Actually, it made the divide between the wealthy and the impoverished even worse. Rapid migration to cities by people searching for these promised industrial jobs ended up creating massive peripheral slums. And most glaringly, this model completely ignored huge systemic social structural impediments. You literally can't just tell a farmer to modernize via radio broadcast if they're trapped by a corrupt bureaucracy or a super unfair land tenure system. Ultimately, because of unequal access to technology, this top-down push just widened the communication gap. So this massive failure forced a pretty natural pivot. Development communication had to evolve from this rigid, one-way megaphone into a dynamic, two-way participatory dialogue. We shifted away from Lerner's top-down modernization, which, remember, blamed the individual and obsessively focused on economic metrics, over to a participatory model. This new way of thinking prioritized interpersonal dialogue, recognized that multiple realities coexist, and actually acknowledged those deep-seated structural flaws in society. We finally stopped shouting at the masses through megaphones and started having real conversations.
Section 4, the diffusion of innovation, how change happens. To truly understand this process, a scholar named Everett Rogers decided to trade the macro blueprint for a magnifying glass to see how individuals actually accept change.
Rogers provided us with this incredible foundational quote. He defined diffusion as the process in which an innovation is communicated through certain channels over time among the members of a social system. So while Lerner was looking at entire countries from 30,000 feet, Rogers was studying the exact mechanics of why an individual user actually clicks install on a new idea, a new practice, or a new piece of technology.
He broke this down into 4 essential elements. First up is the innovation itself, and it literally just has to be perceived as new by the person adopting it. Second, communication channels. Now, while mass media is great for raising awareness, Rogers found that interpersonal communication is what actually shapes opinions. Specifically, communication between people of similar backgrounds, a concept called homophilia, is insanely effective. Third is time, or the rate of adoption. And fourth is the social system, which refers to the underlying norms and structures that govern the community. Section 5. Adopting new ideas. Why we say yes. Now, it's a huge misconception that all innovations are universally beneficial, or that they'll just be adopted uniformly by everyone. So what actually makes us say yes?
This is where it gets really interesting. Rogers breaks down the exact traits that make an innovation completely irresistible. Just look at these 5 characteristics. Relative advantage is pretty simple. Is this new thing better than what I have now? Compatibility. Does it fit my existing values? Complexity. Is it just way too hard to use? Because if it's complex, adoption absolutely drops. But look at trialability and observability. Think about pharmaceutical drugs. They have mandatory trial phases because being able to test something safely on a limited basis drastically increases adoption. Or observability. When you see a friend using a brand new piece of wearable tech and you can see the results for yourself, you are far more likely to go out and buy one. Bottom line, we adopt what we can see, try, and easily understand.
And this brilliantly illustrates how a new idea basically takes over a society. The rate of adoption is definitely not a straight line. It actually follows this S-shaped curve. It starts off pretty slowly with just a few brave innovators and early adopters. Then, as the relative advantage and observability really kick in, it accelerates sharply into this massive spike as the majority gets on board. And finally, it gradually plateaus as the last few holdouts slowly adopt the new norm.
Section 6. The 5 stages of adoption. Psychological steps. We've looked at the big societal view and the traits of the innovation itself. Now, let's get into the exact psychological steps a human being takes when deciding to adopt something new. Rogers calls this the innovation decision process. It's literally a 5-step journey that we all go on over time as we internally weigh the pros and cons. We go from knowledge to persuasion to decision to implementation and finally confirmation. You don't just wake up one morning and randomly change your behavior. You walk down this very specific psychological path.
I want to quickly unpack those first 2 steps because they are absolutely crucial. Stage 1, knowledge, is purely cognitive. You're just gathering the raw data, learning that the innovation exists, how to use it, the principles behind it. But stage 2, persuasion, that is where the magic happens. This is effective, it's emotional. This is where your psychological engagement takes over and you develop a positive or negative attitude toward the idea. Just having the information isn't enough. You literally have to feel emotionally persuaded before you'll ever move on to the decision and implementation stages.
So we've seen that the old blueprints of just forcing modernization from the top down through one-way media, they just don't work. True development requires a real, participatory dialogue, a deep understanding of the social system, and an appreciation for the psychological journey every individual goes on. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. If sweeping societal change can't simply be forced from the top down, how will you communicate your next big idea to ensure people actually want to adopt it? Think about Rogers' 5 stages and those key traits of your innovation the next time you're trying to change a mind. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.